talking about going deeper into community groups, part of the thing that is the most difficult aspect is sharing your story. A lot of people, they don't want to do it. They don't want to feel like, oh gosh, I got to share my feelings. This is going to be where I give you the kind of the best instruction to kind of go forward, remove some of that anxiety about sharing your story, and to really give you the reason why we're doing community groups. It kind of comes down to this. God desires us to be in circles and not just in rows. When we come to Mass, we sit in rows in the pew, we're shoulder to shoulder, we're not making eye contact with each other, and we're facing forward. We're not making eye contact with the priest, except those couple times where they're like during the homily and they stare at you and you feel like they're talking to you and you get all awkward. That's not the place, right? It's a public space where you're not really doing the whole eye contact thing. You're not doing the whole individual thing. It's the group thing, all right? It's the thing that's defined by what by the external thing that's going on, right? But here's the deal about that. You can disengage when you're in rows. On average, we have a church that holds 1,200 people in this building. Can you tell the difference between 1,200 and 1,199? What happens if someone doesn't show up, slips out the door halfway through Mass, slips in the door 3/4 of the way through Mass? It is easy to be anonymous in the pews. And that's just the reality. It's in any situation, it's easy to be anonymous in a crowd. And so what we need to do, Vatican II said it so great when they said, we want full, conscious, and active participation in the liturgy. Right? That's what we want. We want people invested in the liturgy, not just singing the songs, but praying the songs, praying the psalm, praying the scripture readings, knowing what the scripture readings are beforehand, letting those words wash over us and affect our lives, offering our sacrifices with the Eucharist. The church wants full, conscious, and active participation. But here's the deal. The church also says something really important. In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, talking about the liturgy, it actually says before we show up at the liturgy, something else needs to happen prior. That before we worship as a community, we must first learn to worship individually or personally. And so if I'm not evangelized, I don't have a relationship with Christ, and I'm not praying, and I come into church, you know what I'm going to find it as? I'm going to find it as external, repeated, and memorized. That is, it's going to be boring. If I'm not fully engaged intellectually, emotionally, with all that I am as a person, if I'm not fully engaged, if I'm only half engaged or half-heartedly listening, the famous joke by Jim Gaffigan, I love, he's a comedian, he talks about going to Mass as a little kid and his mind wandering. He's like, our Father who art in heaven without the approved consent of Major League Baseball, right? Like our brains just wander. Why? Because we haven't taken the Mass internal. It's external, memorized, and repeated. And even the memorized and repeated, which is important for us to pray together, those things need to become internalized. That just because I speak them out loud, they can be spoken with every ounce of reverence as the most spontaneous and heartfelt prayer. Jesus, quoting the Old Testament, says of his generation, which can be applied to us, these people, they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. But you know what that God wants out of us? He wants us to honor him with our lips, with our hearts close to him. He doesn't want us to no longer honor him with our lips. So the church says it presupposes individual worship before the communal worship, presupposes evangelization before we enter into the formation of the Mass. So what do we need to do? Well, we need community outside of just the parishioners in this public space. We need that social and personal community to hold us accountable. And we're going to get into why small groups. But the real thing is I want to point out is that drifting away, it's easy to do on your own when you're praying. You can drift in your own devotions to God, right? In Lent, I'm praying the rosary every day as part of my devotion, right? I could skip a day. The heavens are going to open up and I'm not going to die. No one's going to find out if I don't really do that. If I say I want to go to daily Mass and I skip a Mass, people aren't going to notice. If I stop paying attention in my prayer and I'm just saying a bunch of words, if my mind drifts away, that can happen very easily. Come into church, not showing up one Sunday, not showing up 5 Sundays in a row. If I go to different Masses or whatever, no one's going to notice if the crowd's big enough. So drifting away is easy when we're in rows, and it's easy when we're alone. But if we're in community, it is impossible, or almost impossible, to just drift away. If your community is real and it's small enough, you're going to notice when someone's gone. You're going to notice when someone's not there because there will literally be a chair that is empty. And so in community groups, we want you to experience that sense of belonging that is so real that it makes you want to stay. You get this inward desire that this is something that is meaningful to me. This is something that keeps me here. This is something where I can actually share the most important things going on with my life and know that I'm not going to be judged. I'm not going to be condemned. I'm going to be supported, and I'm going to be loved, and I'm going to be held accountable. And this is the most important thing. We call it the ABCs of living in a group life. It's very simple because it's in alphabetical order, ABC. The first one is accountability. Now, for men, as we get older, probably the same thing for women too. When men get older, especially when they start making money and having some success in the world, they grow more autonomous. And autonomous is held out as like this big promise. Like, we all want to be autonomous. We want to have freedom, do what we want, do what we, whatever. But the problem with being autonomous is that it often costs us more than what we think it rewards us. You have someone like King David in the Old Testament. We know the story of King David, right? Young guy, killed Goliath, became very favorable, awesome captain in the military, rose up the ranks, ended up being king, anointed by God to take Saul's place. And then we know he saw a naked woman on the rooftop. He slept with her, tried to get her husband to sleep with her because she found out she was pregnant. And then what did he do? Had the guy killed on the battle lines because he didn't go into battle. But a lot of people miss the beginning of the saga of the fall of David, where it says that while his soldiers were out fighting, he remained in the palace during the summer months. So they go to war in the spring and summertime. David decided for the first time ever, the king always goes out to war. Gradually, he began to drift away from his duties, from his responsibilities, from his men. And as he drifted away, who's going to correct him? He's the king. What are you going to walk up to the king and be like, hey, buddy, listen up. I don't think you're participating as much as you should, right? You're fired. That's what's going to happen. And so what did he end up doing? He ended up drifting away so much to the point where he didn't even go into battle anymore. And that was where the temptation got him. He wasn't out where he should have been, and he was where he should not have been. And there he was, and he saw Bathsheba, and they entered into an affair, and they had a kid, and all this stuff ended up happening. And it ended up, this is the crazy thing that a lot of people miss. His eldest son, Absalom, never spoke to him again. By witnessing his father murder a good man, a good soldier, having an affair in his old age when he already had all these wives and all this stuff, his son lost his love for his father. And he actually went to war with his father. And so when his son died, they never were reconciled. That's what happens. There's this arrogance that ends up building up in us, and we become inaccessible. And we do this, right? We end up so easily, we in our strive for being autonomous, we isolate ourselves. And the opposite of that is having someone that you love hold you accountable. What does it mean to be held accountable? You ever have someone that you don't know walk up and tell you how to live your life? I remember one day I was at a grocery store and I was buying a Coke Zero, which is the nectar of the gods. And I was buying a Coke Zero, and this checkout counter high school student looked at me and said, that's not good for you, right? And I said to her, neither's a fist in your face. Just kidding, I didn't say that. But she actually said to me, she actually upbraided me right then and there. She didn't know if I never drank one. Actually, probably looking at me, I live on soda. But she didn't know my story. She didn't know who I was. The thing is this, people tell us what to do, how to be all the time, and we completely ignore them. But when someone that we love says those things to us, it ticks us off, right? More than anyone else. It really gets us because we know they know what they're talking about. And we don't want them to. We don't want them to be right, but we know that they are. There's a saying that, how do you know if you drink too much? Because someone that you love has come up to you and said, you drink too much, right? Because they probably rack themselves with guilt. And, oh no, I shouldn't say anything. It's not my place, it's all this. Maybe I'm exaggerating, maybe I'm looking at it. And then they finally worked up the courage to say it. They're holding you accountable because you've invited them. You have the type of relationship where that is part of their relationship. So you don't hold people accountable that you don't know. So at the beginning of small groups and all this stuff, you're not going to walk around and be like, you know what you need to do, bub? You don't need to do that. When you've invested, and that's the key term, when you've invested into someone's life and they've invited you into that aspect of where they're like, this is what I need, hold me accountable. That's where it's not just another friendship, it's not just another acquaintance. And you know what? This small group, they might not be your best friends. They might not ever reach that super personal or intimate level, but you've invited them to hold you accountable. That's so crucial. And the next is belonging. We need to belong. Every human being wants to belong. Aristotle, the great philosopher, said, you could have all the wealth and all the power in the world, but if you had no friends, you would be miserable. No one to share it with, right? The ideal form of any Christian marriage is friendship with your beloved, right? Who wants to be enemies with your spouse, right? You want to have them be your best friend. You want to know that that's where you belong. Everyone wants the Cheers experience, where everybody knows your name and they're always glad you came. Everyone wants that experience. But we live in a crisis today in the church where people don't know where they belong, and then they don't know how they can contribute. And because of that, they're kind of left on the outside, and so they leave, ultimately. If they don't know where they belong, then they'll feel like alienated, like they shouldn't be there, and they leave. So community groups are our way of turning the tide, investing in people, saying, I'm gonna hold you accountable, yes, but saying like, you belong here. The last one, ABC, the last C is caring. All right, so our church, I don't know what your church is like, but our church, we have, almost 6,000 families. How do 3 priests, handful of deacons, and a handful of really handsome church staff workers, how do we care for the thousands? How do we care for 22,000 individuals? How do we do it? The answer is we don't, we can't. I mean, just think about it in terms of education. How can I educate my parishioners if I have 10,000 adults? Where's all the floor space? Where's the room space? Who are we gonna hire full-time to just cycle people in and out through class after class? There's no room space here, but there is actually enough room space for everyone at their homes. The homes, the living rooms of our city is enough space for every single person to meet in and to grow in their faith. And then what ends up happening? A tragedy happens. Someone gets sick, a child gets sick, a death happens, a parent passes away. The priest can't go and tend to your needs for hours. They come in, they do the rites, they stay with you as a family, with your family, they'll celebrate the funeral or whatever. But how do you get that sustained, ongoing care? It's by people who already know that you belong with them. They're the ones that are going to go out of their way to care for you. They're the ones who are going to supply that needed support system when kind of everything else is being lost. So that's the ABCs of why we need a small group: accountability, belonging, and care. If you get lost in a big church, you need to get into a small group that's connected to the life of the parish. But now we got to talk about how to actually give your story, okay? Now, I call this the art of being honest, because it is an art. Okay, we need to have honesty by way of humility. See, people don't want to share the parts. They don't want to be vulnerable. I don't want to be vulnerable. I hate that word, vulnerable. It's an awkward word sometimes. It's attached to the whole sit in a circle and share your feelings thing, and I don't know. But this is how we want to frame it. We talked about the 4 spaces: public, social, personal, and intimate. Public, social, personal, and intimate. Public is Sunday Mass for many people. It's experience of this external good that we're all here for, right? But what we want is for it to go a lot deeper for our small groups. We want the way you share your life, right? We want that to be social or personal. Sometimes you'll know that, especially at the beginning, you're gonna keep it on a social level. You're gonna share aspects of your life, like what was your first job, or some funny, embarrassing story that happened to you when you were young, or something like that. Those are snapshots of your life that help build real connections with other people. And then you'll know, going on, especially after these next few sessions, when you share a little bit more of the bigger picture of your life, as you take it to that personal level, you'll realize that you need to connect with people on a deeper level than even just social. But that's what we're gonna invite you to do, is to have that personal, the vulnerability to where you can share personal things, not the naked, raw truth, but personal things about yourself. And that goes into our next point. We want vulnerability, not voyeurism, right? That's kind of awkward, but we don't want to make other people feel like uncomfortable because they're like peeping Toms in the window of your life. We don't want people oversharing, sometimes small groups have been known to implode or fall apart because someone overshares about someone else in the group or someone else's spouse or something like that, and word gets, it's awful, it's awful. What do we do? What am I saying? I'm saying that when we share, you're not going to confession, right? You're not uprooting all the deep, dark sins of your soul and dumping it in the lap of someone else and saying, hi, person that I don't know all that well, heal me now. You can't do that to another person, because quite honestly, you couldn't handle it if a group of people did that to you. So what are we inviting you to do? Share the story of God moving in your life, how God has moved in your life. Share the story. Yeah, you can mention the sins, but don't glorify the sins. Don't make it about the sins. Be vulnerable, be honest. Say, I didn't trust God. I didn't have faith in God. I didn't even know if God existed. But don't give the types of details that you reserve for just your intimate friends, just your best friend or your spouse or something like that. And really what I want to do is I want to focus our attention on what we call the 5 things that God uses to grow our faith. The 5 things that God uses to grow our faith. So this comes from another evangelical minister, a guy named Andy Stanley. He's a very practical thinker, and you'll see these in the 5 P's of what the 5 things that God uses to grow your relationship. So when you're planning to share your story, which everyone's going to do in these small groups, you're going to pick a day, share your story with everyone else. I want you to focus on a couple of these 5 things. What you'll be doing is you'll watch a testimony that we have, whether it's by Jen or Jerry or with Jonathan and Kathleen. We have these stories of other people kind of giving you snippets of these 5 things, and they're using that to share their story. They're very honest and very practical ways to share it. So here's the 5 things, and they'll all make sense for you. Number 1, practical teaching. Have you ever heard someone give a sermon or a person tell a story, and the way they shared it, it was just so practical. You felt like you could walk out and just do it right outside the door. So for instance, Mark Hart one time, he's the Bible Geek for Life team, shared what he called no more Catholic bingo, where you're at Mass, Mark 3:17, bingo, like you should know what the gospel reading is before Sunday. And so his challenge was this: on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, read the gospel. It's all online. You can find it easily. That was a practical teaching that for me changed the way I experienced the Mass, right? How many times do we go to Mass over and over again and we don't even pay attention to the readings? We go on autopilot or we daydream. But now I was engaged in the readings, and the cool thing is, especially if you read the gospel, when you hear the different prayers of the church, right, your mind you start to see the connections at the readings and the different prayers, and everything kind of weaves together. But he made that teaching so simple that it changed the way I related to God in the Mass. The next one is providential relationships. Who are those key people in your life? So when you're sharing your story, maybe it's not practical teaching, maybe it was a person in your life that just never let go. No matter how much you kicked and screamed against them, they never let go. Or someone in your life that was just receptive to hearing God's word, and maybe it was the first time you ever experienced evangelizing someone. Maybe it was someone, a student or a teacher who was just witnessed Jesus Christ and just talked about their relationship with God in the Eucharist or in confession, some healing that God did that brought you closer to him. The next one is personal ministry. In Jen's story, we hear of someone who just saw a lot of bad stuff and said, where are the good things? And then she said, you know what, I'm going to go to serve homeless people. And she went and just served homeless people. And it was through that ministry of serving homeless people that she discovered the face of Christ calling her to deeper goodness. That's where she discovered the goodness. And so sometimes from our personal ministry, God can actually work even deeper in our hearts. The next one's private disciplines. Jonathan and Kathleen Cardinal shared about how Eucharistic adoration in their lives, before they were ever married or anything, it was the private discipline of going to adoration that awakened their heart to something more than just memorizing facts and figures about their faith, that this was in fact a relationship. And finally, the last one is pivotal circumstances, like events in your life, like going on a retreat, like a car accident or something like that that woke you up, that made you say, oh my goodness, I'm not living a purpose-driven life. I'm floating along. As the great Catholic G.K. Chesterton once said, any dead thing can go with the stream. It takes a living thing to go against it. So what are those pivotal circumstances that God used in your life to help reveal to you more and more about himself? So again, those 5 things that God uses is number 1, practical teaching. Number 2, providential relationships. Number 3, personal ministry. Number 4, private disciplines. And number 5, pivotal circumstances. So think about your story, think about your life, and realize that these things have been planted in your life. Pick a couple of them, and as you begin to work your testimony, aim for about 15 to 20 minutes of sharing your story. Pick out a handful of people, relationships, circumstances, events that have happened in your life, and begin to just share with people your story. I guarantee you what's going to happen is you're going to share something that someone else, that it'll strike a chord in their heart. And you might not even know that other person sitting in the circle with you, but it'll strike their heart and they'll say something like, I've never heard it that way, or, oh my gosh, that was exactly what happened to me. And a connection will be formed because of your honesty, your humility, and your vulnerability. Right? And so that's what we want to do. This begins the great work of community. This is the humility or the honesty that only humility can bring. And so by doing this, we are going to build a church that is for people like God is for us. God bless you.